His eyes were burning. This wasn't some poetic metaphor. Charles felt the heat of shame rising past his temples as he kneeled on the cold linoleum of the utility room, that cramped, soulless box where no one in the main house ever set foot. His hands, accustomed to signing million-dollar contracts on glass and steel desks, were trembling as they pulled an old, beat-up shoebox from under the iron bed frame. His sweaty palms slipped on the cardboard edges. He took a deep breath. A man's entire life can fit into a few seconds of absolute silence, and Charles was living that moment right now. Inside the box, there were no shoes. There was a yellowed envelope, brittle with age, and a baby blanket. Small, white, pristine. Charles reached out his fingers to touch it and stopped. The light blue embroidery quivered before his eyes. He knew that stitching. He had watched those letters being sewn, thread by thread, by the woman he loved. A woman who died 5 years ago. A woman who never got to hold a child. The photo slid out of the envelope delicately. Young, smiling, his wife. She was holding that same blanket against her chest as if it were made of solid gold, as if it were the only thing that mattered. Charles's breathing became jagged. He couldn't take a full breath. He inhaled in small, shallow gasps, like a child who has been crying for hours and can't quite recover. When he looked up, she was there, in the doorway, pale as a dying candle, 7 months pregnant. Sarah. Her hands instinctively protected her belly, her eyes didn't blink. It was that heavy silence that precedes the worst revelations, when two people look at each other and understand everything that hasn't been said for months. Him with the blanket in his hand. Her with her entire life crumbling on her hardened face. Their eyes met. Nothing was said. Everything was said. Time rewound a few months. Back to when everything was routine and invisibility. Sarah woke up at 5:00 a.m. Always. She had an alarm on an old clock that marked the hour with the buzz of a dying insect. She opened her eyes in the dark of her bedroom, in that run-down duplex in a neighborhood where the houses were glued together like crooked teeth. The first thing she did was run her hand over her belly and whisper something that sounded like a prayer no one had ever taught her to pray. Then came the Sterling estate. Charles's mansion was everything Sarah would never be. White, clean, cold in the way only glass and mirrors can be cold. Everything in its place. Nothing overflowed. The cushions on the Italian sofas were never creased. The abstract paintings Charles had bought because someone told him they had value never strayed from their straight, perfect lines. And Sarah was the invisible hand that kept it that way. She entered through the service entrance. Always the service entrance. It didn't need to be said. She knew. She knew by the way Charles looked at her when he passed through the kitchen. He looked at her the way one looks at a refrigerator. A necessary object, but one that didn't merit conversation. On that specific day, like every day, Sarah was cleaning. Her body carried the weight of the pregnancy like someone lugging a heavy suitcase on a sweltering day. The living room floor required her to hand polish the wood. She was on her knees, supporting her weight on her hands, her belly hanging low like she was carrying a secret. Her fingers, already swollen from the pregnancy, trembled slightly. Being pregnant wasn't easy. The money wasn't enough. And Charles had never asked how she felt. He was in the living room when Sarah felt sick. She got dizzy suddenly. The marble floor spun beneath her eyes. She leaned against the wall, breathing deeply, waiting for the sensation to pass. Charles saw her. He was reading the Wall Street Journal in his usual seat, that armchair no one else was allowed to sit in because it was his. He saw, and he asked nothing. He simply stood up, walked to the kitchen, grabbed a manila envelope from the island counter, walked back into the room where Sarah was still leaning against the wall, and tossed the envelope onto the wet bar with a coldness that could have frozen a lake. Your wages, through Monday. Don't leave watermarks on the china again. Sarah took the envelope. There was no thank you. There was no how are you. There was only the humiliation that lands so lightly it seems normal, until you realize it's plated in gold, and yet is still just humiliation. When she headed home, the crowded bus steamed with the heat of too many bodies. Sarah rested her hand on the metal rail and watched the people. Tired old men, mothers with children, Women who, like her, were somewhere they didn't want to be. The child inside her moved. She placed her free hand on her belly and whispered that prayer again. "We're going to be okay, my son. We're going to be okay." At home, in the room that was hers and no one else's, Sarah prepared the layette with scraps of fabric she managed to get from discount bins. A blanket with the faded color of someone who had once had bigger dreams. Diapers she washed by hand because a washing machine was a luxury for those who had more than just the necessities. She looked at an old photo of a woman she had clipped from a discarded newspaper at Charles's house. She didn't know why she had done that. She had just felt something in that smile. She felt that woman, somewhere in time and injustice, understood what it was to wait for something the world didn't seem to want to give. Sarah looked at that photo, then at her own belly, with an expression that was a mix of pain and determination. "He will be born into a better world than this," she said to her son inside her. "He will." But she didn't believe it. The following week came with the sound of the crash. Sarah was in the guest room, that room that felt like a museum of things no one used anymore. She had climbed onto the step stool to dust the high shelves of the closet. The stool was old, the kind that creaks when you shift your weight. She was reaching for the dust cloth way in the back when her hand bumped a box someone had left there, forgotten by time. The box fell. Photographs scattered across the floor like autumn leaves from an interrupted dream. Sarah climbed down from the stool carefully. Her feet touched the photos. One of them showed Charles, younger, with the smiling woman from the newspaper Sarah had in her room. They were on a beach, her body leaning into his. His face wore the expression of a man who had found everything. Sarah gathered the photos with shaking hands. She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't be touching someone else's memories. But as she gathered them, her eyes stopped on something in the middle of the images. A small white blanket, embroidered in light blue, laid out as if someone had placed it there with care many years ago. Sarah knew that handiwork. She herself had embroidered fabrics like that when she was learning the craft. She knew the kind of love that went into every stitch. She knew it because she had that same kind of love inside her now, waiting for her son. She picked up the blanket, blinked. Her heart was beating strangely. Her instinct screamed that she shouldn't, but her hands were already tucking the blanket into her apron, along with everything else that fit into the life of a housekeeper 7 months pregnant. She needed something. She didn't know what, but she needed it. When Sarah finally left the room, the empty box was left behind on the floor. A few photos were still there, scattered, and then she heard the footsteps. Charles was coming down the hallway. She saw him through the open door of the guest room. He walked slowly, then stopped. He stopped right at the entrance of the messy room. He saw the photos. He saw the empty box. His face changed expression. That man who never showed anything on his face, who was always braced by his work and his indifference, began to show anger, a silent rage that burned behind his eyes. He looked down the hall where Sarah had already disappeared, taking with her the blanket he didn't know she had seen. Charles found Sarah the next day. It wasn't accidental. He had been waiting for the right moment, the right place, when there were no witnesses. A rich man's life is made of calculations like this: when to speak, when to stay silent, when to destroy someone quietly so as not to leave visible marks. Sarah was folding bedsheets in the laundry room when she heard him arrive. The sound of his dress shoes on the ceramic tile came like a storm warning. She knew, her body knew, her baby knew, because he started to move with agitation inside her belly, as if he sensed the danger before she did. Charles closed the laundry room door. He didn't lock it. He didn't need to. The silence of the empty house did that for him. "Sarah." She turned, still holding a white sheet in her hand. The fabric felt fragile suddenly, as if it might dissolve at the touch. "Yes, Mr. Sterling." Her voice came out small. She had already learned to make her voice small. You learn fast when your livelihood depends on it. "The guest room. You were in there yesterday." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed as a simple sentence. "Yes, sir. Deep cleaning, as you asked." "Deep enough to rifle through my personal belongings," Sarah breathed. She breathed like someone preparing to tell a lie that could cost them their life. "There was an accident." A box fell. "I picked everything up, sir. I left everything as it was." Charles walked closer. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The space he occupied was enough to suffocate her. He smelled of expensive cologne and bitter coffee. He smelled like someone who slept well while others wept. "You picked everything up?" "Yes, sir." "All the photos?" Sarah blinked. Her heart was racing like an animal trapped in a very small cage. "All of them, sir." Charles tilted his head. That gesture, so small, so simple, was more terrifying than a scream. It was the gesture of a man who knew he had been lied to. It was the gesture of a predator who had heard the sound of prey. "Because," said Charles, his voice still calm, still professional, "those photographs are mine, and I don't recall authorizing anyone to touch them." "I didn't know, sir. I was just cleaning." "Cleaning. Right." He paused. A long pause. A pause that lasted centuries. "From now on, the guest room is no longer your responsibility. No room on the second floor will be your responsibility. You will focus on the first floor, the kitchen, and your utility room." Sarah nodded. That was half her work disappearing. That was less money, less security. Less of the one thing she desperately needed. "And Sarah," Charles continued, "if I find anything out of place, anything that seems suspicious to me, I will assume it was you. And I will have to resolve it in the manner I deem appropriate." He didn't specify what was appropriate. He didn't have to. The word termination hung in the air like a ghost everyone could see. "Yes, sir. Understood, sir." "Good. You can continue with your work." Charles left the laundry room. The silence returned. But now it was a different silence. It was the silence after a threat. The white sheet fell from Sarah's hands and spread on the floor like a surrender. The days that followed were like living inside a nightmare you can't wake up from. Sarah accelerated her work. Her body, already heavy with the 7-month pregnancy, was now pushed beyond its limits. She cleaned more. She cleaned faster. She cleaned with the desperation of someone who knows every movement could cost her job. The pain started in the 3rd week. It was a sharp pain in her lower back, as if someone were pulling her internal organs out. It was a pain that came when she crouched to scrub the floor. A pain that stayed when she stood up. Sarah breathed deep and kept going, wiped a counter, cleaned a window, organized an armchair. All while her legs swelled and her heart raced for reasons that weren't just pregnancy. One night at home, she couldn't get up. She lay on the floor of her bedroom for 2 hours, hands on her belly, whispering to her son inside her that he needed to be okay, because there was no plan B. There was no safety net. There was no one to catch her if she fell. In the 2nd week of pain, Sarah finally couldn't take it anymore. She took a day off that wasn't allowed. She knew this would be docked from her pay, but a pregnant woman can't live with a screaming body. She knew that. Her body knew. And her baby knew too. The doctor's office was a simple room in a neighborhood far away, where doctors still saw people like Sarah without charging a fortune. The doctor was an old man, with thick glasses and hands that trembled a little but touched Sarah's belly with a gentleness she hadn't felt in months. "How have you been feeling?" he asked. "Fine, doctor. Just fine." He smiled, as if he knew it was a lie. As if he heard lies like that all the time. "Are you working a lot?" Sarah didn't answer. "Your blood pressure is high," the doctor continued. "Too high for someone your age. You are at risk. Your baby is at risk. You need rest. Urgent bed rest." He wrote on a slip of paper. The letters flowed from the pen like a sentence. He tore the paper from the pad and handed it to Sarah. "You give this to your employer. He has to respect it. It's the law." Sarah took the paper. Her name was there. The pregnancy was there. The phrase urgent bed rest was there, in letters that left no doubt. She looked at the paper, then at the office door, then at her belly. How was she going to give this to Charles? That night, Sarah entered the mansion differently. The paper was in her purse, burning like a hot coal against her heart. She knew what was going to happen. She knew because she had spent months observing Charles, learning how he thought, understanding that a man who threatens termination doesn't accept medical excuses for lost productivity. Charles was in the living room when she placed his dinner plate on the table. "Sir," she said, and her voice seemed to come from very far away. "I need to show you something." She placed the paper next to the plate. Her heart was already beating too fast. The paper was there, defenseless now, waiting for the judgment of a man who had no pity. Charles picked up the paper, read it with narrowed eyes. His expression didn't change. That was the most terrifying thing. When a face doesn't change, it's because it has already decided something very bad. "Urgent bed rest," he read aloud as if testing the words. "My pressure, sir, and the baby. The doctor said it was necessary." The doctor. He put the paper back on the table. "How much time do you want off?" "He didn't specify, sir, but—" "How much time?" Sarah breathed. "Maybe 2 weeks." Charles chuckled. It was a joyless sound, just air leaving the lungs of someone who had heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. 2 weeks, and who is going to do your work?" "I don't know, sir." "You don't know, of course you don't know." He picked up his fork. "You will stay home for 1 week, not 2, 1. And when you return, you will make up every hour you missed. You will work nights if necessary, do you understand?" Sarah felt something break inside her. That wasn't a negotiation, it was extortion. It was a powerful man telling a weak woman that she could easily disappear if she didn't obey. "Yes, sir." "Good. Now get out of here, you're distracting me." Sarah left the room. She went up to her utility room and closed the door. She opened her purse and took out the white blanket embroidered in light blue. She hugged that cloth like it was a shield, as if it were the only truth in a world made of lies and obedience. She put her hand on her belly. "He's going to let you stay," she whispered. "Just 1 week. 1 week and you're safe again." But she didn't believe it. And her baby, inside her, was already learning to disbelieve too. The week of rest Charles allowed was the cruelest thing he could have done. Because Sarah realized, in those days of silence in her cramped room, that there was no place to rest. Not when every rest was theft. Not when every hour she didn't work was an hour she should have been working. Not when her baby needed to be born into a world where his mother had access to everything except dignity. On the 3rd day of rest, Sarah did something that required more courage than cleaning mansions. She went out to seek help. The social services office was in an old building, where walls yellowed with mold told stories of years of neglect. Women like Sarah were there too. Pregnant women. Women with children in their arms. Women who had the same fear in their eyes. Sarah took a number. It was 234. There were 47 people ahead of her. She waited 3 hours. Her belly weighed like a rock. Her swollen feet screamed inside her shoes. But she waited, because hope is the last refuge of the desperate, and Sarah still had a little hope. When her turn finally came, a woman with deep dark circles under her eyes called her to a noisy desk in an even noisier room. "What do you need?" the woman asked without lifting her eyes from the computer. "I need to speak about my rights. My employer, he isn't allowing me to rest. I have a doctor's note, but he said he'll only give me a week." The woman typed something else. Her fingers tapped on the keyboard as if playing a very sad song. "Do you have a contract? W-2? "No, ma'am." "Is he paying payroll taxes in your name?" "No, ma'am." The woman finally looked up. They were the eyes of someone who had seen 1,000 Sarahs before her, and would see 1,000 more after. "No contract, no record, paid under the table. You are an informal worker. Technically, you don't have labor protections." The words fell like stones. Sarah breathed slowly. "But the doctor's note, that's valid, isn't it?" "Valid, yes. But who is going to force an employer to respect it? Are you going to sue? Do you have money for a lawyer?" Sarah didn't answer. "What I can suggest," continued the woman with a tone that resembled pity but was just exhaustion, "is that you talk to your employer. Explain the situation. Often, things can be resolved with communication." It was a cycle. Sarah was inside a circle that was closing in tighter and tighter, and the only advice the system had was to go back to the start of the circle. She left there with her hands shaking. That night, when she returned to Charles's mansion to set dinner, she found something different in his face. something that looked almost like concern. Charles was in the living room, more chatty than usual. "Sarah, how are you feeling?" She froze. This was new, this was abnormal, this was dangerous. "Fine, sir, better." "Did your rest help?" "Yes, sir." Charles stood up, walked over to her. Not as close as in the laundry room, but close enough for her to feel the space shrink. "I was thinking," he said, his voice using a tone that tried to be amiable but sounded like a snake speaking, "that perhaps you need a better doctor. A friend of mine, Dr. Henderson, is excellent. He treats many of my acquaintances. I can schedule an appointment for you. My expense." Sarah blinked. It was a trap. She knew it was a trap because her survival instinct, the one that had kept her alive for 26 years, screamed that it was a trap. But she also needed a doctor. She needed someone to confirm that she and her baby were okay, and Charles was offering. That's very kind, sir. It's not kindness, it's care for my employees. I'll schedule it for tomorrow." Dr. Henderson's office was the kind Sarah had never stepped foot in. The walls were white, so white they seemed to absorb color. There were plants that looked plastic but weren't. There was a receptionist who looked at her as if she didn't know exactly what to do with a pregnant, poorly dressed woman. The doctor was also a man in his 50s, with suits that cost more than Sarah's annual earnings. He examined her with professional hands and a smile that had the depth of a puddle. After he examined her, he started asking questions. Questions about her family. Questions about who the father of the baby was. Questions about her financial conditions. And with each question, Sarah understood that this wasn't care. It was an investigation. It was Charles trying to discover something about her through a man who owed him favors. When the doctor asked if she had received any kind of benefit or help from the baby's father, Sarah simply said she didn't want to talk about it. The doctor stopped asking questions, but the damage had been done. He had collected what he wanted, and she had understood the message. Charles wasn't taking care of her. Charles was investigating her. That night, while putting dirty clothes in a hamper, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't stay there anymore. She could no longer trust that things would get better. She could no longer believe that Charles would allow her to rest, that she would have her baby with dignity, that she would leave there as a person and not a worn-out tool. She needed to get out. She needed to disappear. Sarah secretly started to gather her few possessions. A change of clothes here, an object there. She sold kitchen items Charles didn't use anymore, getting cash at pawn shops for amounts that seemed like insults but were all she had. She guarded every dime like treasure. On the 6th day of her return, Sarah decided it was time. That night, when Charles was asleep, she would take what she had and simply leave. She would go back to her mother's house in the country. She would have her baby there, try to start over. She entered her utility room with her heart racing. The old suitcase was under the bed. She started packing her things, her documents, her clothes. And then she remembered. The blanket, the white blanket embroidered in light blue. Sarah crouched down and reached for the shoebox that was under the bed. Her hand swept through the empty space where the box should have been. It wasn't there. Her heart stopped. Sarah knelt on the floor and rummaged through everything under the bed. Dust, an old shoe, nothing else. The box had vanished. And inside that box, the blanket, her shield, her secret. Her only thing connecting her to a truth she didn't fully understand yet, but felt in the marrow of her bones was important. She stood up, panic rising in her chest like water in a sinking ship. That was when the door opened. Charles was there, holding the shoebox. He wasn't asleep. He was awake. He was waiting. Maybe he had always been waiting. Charles's eyes, which she had never seen hold real emotion before, now showed something that was almost like curiosity. That dangerous curiosity of a cat playing with a mouse. "What are you hiding from me, Sarah?" he asked, his voice so calm it sounded like he was asking about the weather. He hadn't opened the box yet, but you could see in his fingers that he knew exactly what was inside. Sarah couldn't breathe. Her belly contracted. Her baby, that little survivor inside her, also felt the danger. "I'm not hiding anything, sir," she whispered, but the words had no belief inside them. Charles went. Because it looks like you were packing to leave. The suitcase was there, open, with her few things inside, her last refuge, her last plan, all exposed. "Sir, Sarah started but couldn't finish. Charles opened the box. Inside, among other small items Sarah had kept, was the white blanket. He picked it up with those fingers that had never worked a day in their life. He held it up to the light. "This blanket belonged to my wife," he said slowly, as if pronouncing every word in a foreign language. Sarah waited for the explosion, waited for the anger, waited for the firing, for the cursing, for the final humiliation. But what came was different. What came was the truth in his eyes. Because Charles, holding that blanket, finally saw what had been lost in his own pain for so long. "Why do you have this, Sarah?" he asked, and for the first time in all those months, his voice wasn't the voice of a boss. It was the voice of a man who was understanding something the whole world had been showing him, but he was too blind to see. Sarah breathed. A last breath. The moment had arrived, the moment when secrets were no longer secrets, the moment when everything that had been hidden under beds, inside boxes, protected by silence and fear, finally came to light. "Because," began Sarah, her voice trembling but clear, "she was my mother. Because she was my mother." The words came out like a deathbed confession, like something that had been buried so deep it demanded to be dug up with bare hands, bleeding and without anesthesia. Charles froze. The blanket in his hands suddenly became as heavy as the entire universe. His eyes closed, then opened, then closed again as if he couldn't decide if he wanted to see that face in front of him. How did you have a photo of—" Sarah was breathing very fast. Her baby moved with panic inside her. It was as if her whole body was screaming, as if every cell knew this was the moment where everything could be lost or finally reclaimed. "The woman in the photo. Her name was Anne," said Sarah, and her voice was steady now because it had been fragile for too long. "She was my sister." Charles sat on the bed, not just sat, collapsed, as if his legs had given up holding him. "No, you're lying. I am not. Anne had a family. She didn't have a younger sister. I knew her entire family." "You knew the family she wanted you to know," Sarah replied. "You didn't know my mother. You didn't know the poverty. You didn't want to know." Charles's eyes searched her face for signs of Anne, and there they were, in the cheekbones, in the way she blinked, in the small details that only someone who loved her would have noticed. 5 years. 5 years since Anne's death, and he had never seen her ghost, who had been cleaning his house. Why did she never mention you?" Sarah sat on the floor. Her legs couldn't keep her standing. Not anymore. "Because she abandoned us," said Sarah, and now there was anger in her voice too. Anger that had been stored, fermenting, growing like an infected wound for years. "She married you and decided she didn't come from a poor place anymore. That she didn't have a mother. That she didn't have a sister. That she began and ended with you and your money. That's not true. Anne wasn't like that." "You didn't know her," Sarah continued, tears now running unchecked. "You loved the idea of Anne, the beautiful Anne, the educated Anne, the Anne you molded according to your desires. But the sister I knew, the sister who raised me when our mother got sick, that Anne who told me stories at night and said that one day I would have a better life than hers, that Anne you destroyed." Charles didn't move. It was as if he had turned to stone. "When she got pregnant," Sarah continued, her words coming out like a torrent now that it had started, "she wanted to tell me. She wanted me to meet my nephew. But you said my presence stressed her. You said my influence was harmful. You said my poverty could harm the child." Sarah breathed, a tremendous breath, a breath of someone who was donating her lungs to tell the truth. "So when she went to the hospital, when labor started, you forbade me from being there. You blocked me from the waiting room, told security I wasn't family." Charles's shoulders began to shake. She died, Charles. She and the baby died because the doctor said there were complications that could have been avoided if she hadn't been so stressed, so isolated, so alone. No, whispered Charles. I was in the hallway, Sarah continued, her voice now so quiet it seemed he had to lean in to hear. I snuck in afterwards. I saw her. I saw her little belly still big, but empty. I saw the blanket she had embroidered still inside the glass bassinet, waiting for the baby that would never arrive. Charles put his face in his hands. I took the blanket. I stole it. Because it was the only part of her left for anyone. The only proof that she had existed and that she had loved someone other than you. Charles's tears fell to the floor. There was no sob or sound, just the body of a man being undone by every word. I carried that blanket with me for 5 years, said Sarah. I worshipped it, I prayed to it, because it was all I had of my sister, of my adoptive mother, of the woman who abandoned me to be happy, but found out that happiness was just an illusion that money and power pretend to create. Charles lifted his face. His eyes were 2 black holes, empty, bottomless. When I got pregnant, continued Sarah, I had no one. My mother had grown old. My father was long gone. No job would accept me. I had no security. So I came to the city. I looked for work. And for some reason I still don't understand. You were looking for a maid. You knew who I was, said Charles, and it wasn't a question. Of course I knew. Do you think I wouldn't see your face a dozen times in photos? Photos Anne kept hidden in her house, even while hating you? Photos of you two on the beach, in the mountains, in the moments she still thought she was happy? Charles moved, slowly, like someone learning to move again after a long illness. He approached Sarah. She thought he was going to scream, that he was going to kick her out, that he was going to vomit all the pain he had been keeping for 5 years right in her face. But he knelt. Charles knelt in front of Sarah and reached out his hand to touch the blanket that was still in the box, lying on the floor. His fingers trembled. Why didn't you say anything? He asked. Because you would have kicked me out, replied Sarah. Because you would have called the police. Because you would have destroyed Anne's memory completely. You would have burned that blanket and pretended she never existed, like you always did with everything that didn't fit into your perfect life. Charles touched the blanket as if it were made of glass that could break with a wrong breath. And after I knew I was pregnant, I realized, Sarah continued, her voice breaking, that I needed a safe place, a place where my son could grow. And this mansion, even being cold, even having you in it, was a place where Anne had prepared a room, because she wanted a child so desperately, as much as I want mine. Charles looked up at Sarah's belly. His face was completely destroyed. It wasn't the face of a powerful man. It was the face of someone who had understood, in a unique and devastating instant, that his entire life had been built on the blood and tears of people he had chosen not to see. You waited, said Charles slowly. Waited for what? You waited until you were far enough along that you could leave. You were trying to run away when I came in. You didn't want my money. You didn't want my name. You just wanted out. Sarah didn't answer. Because you hate me, continued Charles. Because I should hate you, replied Sarah. You killed my sister as completely as if you had put a gun to her head. You cut her off from everything that made her human, from everything that kept her alive. And when she finally died, you blamed her poverty, blamed my existence, blamed everything except yourself. Charles looked at the blanket again. If she had had you, he whispered, if she had had you during the pregnancy, during the birth, during those 5 years, she wouldn't have died alone. You would have been there. You would have held her hand. Yes, said Sarah. And now you are here. You are pregnant. In my house. And He didn't finish the sentence, because there was no ending that wasn't a confession of everything he had lost by being exactly who he had chosen to be. I will let you leave, said Charles, and his voice was the sound of someone who had died and resurrected, as someone completely different. You will leave my house. You will take everything Anne loved. You will take the blanket. You will have your baby wherever you wish. And I will. He stopped. I will be here, hoping you allow me to meet him, that I can repair, But he knew there was no repair. A whole lifetime wasn't enough to fix what had broken. He reached out his hand to touch Sarah's belly, that baby who was the last living link to Anne, that baby who was the only redemption the universe had planned for a man who had chosen to be blind. "May I?" asked Charles, as if asking permission not just to touch but to live again. Sarah breathed, a long breath, and nodded. Charles's hand touched her belly, and when he felt the baby move, when he felt that little life pulse under his palms, Charles cried in a way a man only cries when he finally understands that forgiveness is just the first word of a much larger conversation about justice, redemption, and what it means to be alive when everything you loved is dead. The silence in the room was the silence after an explosion, when the dust is still falling and the air still trembles with the impact. Sarah said nothing. She simply reached out and took the blanket from Charles's hands. The action was deliberate. It was a reclaiming. It was a woman taking possession of what belonged to her by right of blood, by right of memory, by right of having been left behind. She folded it, slowly, with care. Every fold was a gesture of meaning. It wasn't just folding to put away. It was the act of someone who had finally stopped waiting for permission to care for what she loved. Her fingers touched the light blue embroidery for the 1,000th time in 5 years. But this time, it was touched in the presence of the one who had taken Anne from the world. "I'm going to say something," began Sarah, and her voice now had weight, had authority, had the quality of someone who had finally claimed her place in the world. "And you are going to listen. You are going to listen well, because this might be the first and last time someone tells you the truth, without fear." Charles, still kneeling, nodded. "You killed Anne as completely as possible without using your hands. You took her name from her, took her people, took her history, took the dignity of dying knowing there were people who loved her besides you. And when she died, you didn't just lose her. You lost the possibility of redemption." The tears continued falling down Charles's face, but now he let them fall. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't deny them. "But," continued Sarah, and here her voice acquired a quality that was almost compassion, "I am here. Me, who you humiliated. Me, who you exploited. Me, who you treated like the air you breathed without noticing. I am here because you didn't destroy me completely. Because there is still something alive in me that wasn't consumed by your coldness." Sarah breathed. "And because of that, I will allow you to try. Not for you, for Anne, for my son, for that child you and Anne never had. You will have a chance to be who you should have been all along. But know that this chance, it is not a gift. It is an obligation you will have to carry for the rest of your life." Charles lowered his head. "And the first thing you are going to do is stop kneeling." He stood up, slowly, like someone learning to stand again. "Stand up," said Sarah. "Men who ask for forgiveness on their knees don't understand what forgiveness means. Forgiveness is standing up. It's looking into the eyes of the person you hurt and telling the truth without hiding." Charles stood up. His eyes met Sarah's. And in that meeting, there was the final recognition. The recognition that Anne had come to him twice in life, once as a wife and now as a sister. "I was a very cruel man to you," said Charles. And his voice was steady because he was standing now, because he had finally chosen to be present in his own destruction. "I was cruel because I was afraid. Afraid that someone simple, someone real, could show Anne that the life I was building for her was built only of emptiness. Afraid she would realize that money doesn't fill silences. Afraid she would leave me. And so," continued Sarah, "you killed her. Because when you isolated her completely, when you cut her off from everything that made her human, you guaranteed she wouldn't have the strength to survive the birth." "Yes," replied Charles. I killed my wife. I killed my son. And I spent 5 years pretending I was a man when I was just an empty shell. There was truth in those words. Truth is heavy. But sometimes truth is the only thing that can sustain two human beings who are meeting for the first time. Now, said Sarah, you are going to listen to me. You are going to leave here and you are going to do 3 things. Charles waited. First, you are going to call your personal doctor. You are going to schedule a full checkup for me. Ultrasound, blood pressure, everything. Because my baby is going to be born healthy. Because this baby is going to be cared for in a way Anne never was. Done, replied Charles immediately. Second, you are going to prepare a room. The best room in this house. It will be mine and my son's. You will not enter without permission. You will not touch anything without being invited. That room will be inviolable. Done, replied Charles again. Third, you are going to tell your staff, your friends, whoever asks, that I am your sister-in-law. That I carry your wife's maiden name in my son. That I am not your maid. That I am not anyone you need to be ashamed of. Charles took a deep breath. Done, he said. And Sarah, there is a 4th thing I need to do. What? Order a contract, a formal contract with rights, with a decent salary, with respect. If you decide to stay here, you will be here as a person, not as the one who was exploited before. Sarah blinked. That was an offer she had never expected to receive. You are saying you want me to continue being your maid? No, replied Charles. I am saying I want you to continue here, as my family, in any role you wish to occupy. But if you need work, you will have dignified work. You will have security, you will have protection, because it is the minimum you deserve. Sarah nodded slowly. That night, the best room in the house was prepared. Not by maids who didn't know her. It was prepared by Charles with his own hands, like a man who was learning that reparation is action, not just words. The months that followed were a slow relearning of how to live. Charles dropped the armor he had built. He spoke less, observed more, learned in the way only those willing to die completely to start over can learn. Sarah had her appointments, had her rights, had her dignity, and when the baby was born, a little girl with Anne's eyes, Charles held her. He held her in the room that had been prepared for the son who never arrived, and in that room, now renovated and filled with light, there was a dresser, and on the dresser the white blanket embroidered in light blue was framed, next to a photo of Anne smiling, young, hopeful. The girl slept in her uncle's arms, and he whispered things to her that Anne would never hear. Things like, I'm sorry. Things like welcome. Things like you are loved. Sarah watched from the door, hands protecting her empty belly, because now there was space for something new. What is her name? Asked Charles. Anne, replied Sarah. Like her mother, like her aunt. So she carries the story of all the women who were silenced, and through her life finally speaks. Charles looked at the girl, at the embroidery on the blanket, at Anne's photo on the wall, and finally understood that justice is not revenge. Justice is recognition. It is the act of stopping the denial of the suffering of those we hurt. It is allowing them to exist completely, without erasure, without denial. Did you know she would be her aunt? Asked Charles. No, replied Sarah. But Anne always knew. From somewhere. Anne always knew she would have a child in this house, that this child would carry her name and her story, because she loved too much to disappear completely. Charles looked up at Sarah. Thank you, he whispered, for allowing me to be here, for allowing me to be more than my worst moment. Sarah walked close to them, placed her hand next to his, both holding the girl who was the future reclaimed from the ashes of the past. Justice, said Sarah, is slow, but when it finally arrives, it arrives as recognition. It isn't blood, it isn't punishment. It is just two human beings understanding that both were wounded by the same pain, and that the only way to heal is to allow those we love to live again in memory. And in the silence of that room, between the man who had learned too late And the woman who had waited long enough, a baby slept. A baby named in honor of the one whose love had been so strong it crossed death, years, and silence to arrive at this exact moment. This is the moment where the story ends, not with revenge, not with victory, but with the recognition that sometimes the greatest justice is simply allowing life to continue, scars to heal, and new names to be given to those who come after. It is revolting to see someone treated with such coldness and contempt, isn't it? To see a pregnant woman exploited while carrying a secret that burned in her chest. If you also think dignity must be recognized and that everyone deserves to be seen completely, smash that like button right now to support Sarah and all the women who carry silent stories. Because this story taught us that true justice is not revenge, but recognition. That compassion is not weakness, but courage. That sometimes those who hurt us most deeply are those who are also hurting, just in a way we manage to see too late. If you like emotional stories like this, stories that show the complexity of human suffering and the long road to redemption, subscribe to the channel to become part of our family. Because stories like Sarah and Charles's need to be told, need to be heard. Because somewhere, right now, someone is living the real version of this story. And that person needs to know that recognition will come, that dignity can be reclaimed, that the silence can finally end,